They say some secrets rot the air around them, that when truth is buried long enough, the earth itself begins to whisper. Listen carefully now, because what I'm about to tell you was never meant to surface. It was sealed in the archives of a dying empire, hidden behind false ledgers and burned confessions. But every secret leaves an echo, and tonight, we follow one. Lima, 1803, a city polished in gold leaf and hypocrisy, where the church bells rang over mansions built on bones. The Palacio de Diage residence stood at the top of this world. Whitewashed walls, embroidered servants, and silence so precise it could cut glass. But beneath its floors, in the hollows of that perfect order, something unspeakable stirred. It began not with love, but with the slow corruption of obedience. A man, a slave named Domingo, born into property, trained in silence, was assigned to repair what no one else touched, the private chambers of power. And there, in the quiet hours between candlelight and confession, the hierarchy fractured. You must understand, Lima's nobility believed themselves untouchable, vessels of divine authority. The Marquise of Diage Velasco and her 3 daughters moved through life as living symbols of purity and rule. To touch them was to challenge the natural order ordained by both church and crown. Yet what if that order was the lie? What if the system built to enslave one man became the very thing that enslaved them all? This was not a romance. It was a revolt wrapped in flesh. A moment when centuries of control cracked under the weight of something older than law, desire, defiance, and destiny. By the summer of that year, 4 women of noble blood found themselves carrying the same secret. Each tried to hide it beneath layers of silk and prayer. Each failed, because truth, once awakened, refuses to stay buried. Now imagine the morning the servants realized. The subtle panic of altered dresses, the tremor in the Marquise's voice, the house priest's trembling hands as he opened the blue room door and saw what civilization denied could ever happen. 4 women, all swelling with life. 1 father, a man forbidden to exist except as property. You've just stepped into the first chamber of a forbidden truth. And once you see what lies beneath this house of virtue, there will be no way back. History will tell you that Lima in 1803 was a city of elegance, etiquette, and devotion. But that's a lie told by victors too afraid of their own reflection. The truth is that Lima was already rotting from within. Every church sermon, every aristocratic smile, every lavish ball was a performance designed to distract the masses from the decay behind the curtains. The Marquise's mansion was the perfect stage, immaculate, disciplined, silent. But silence is never the absence of sound. It is the muffled heartbeat of rebellion waiting to be heard. Domingo had learned this long before he entered that house. Sold and resold like a tool, he had studied the language of power from the ground up, watching men of title tremble behind their own rules. He had learned that obedience was a mask, and masks could be weapons. In the Palacio's household, he became indispensable. The carpenter who repaired what others broke, the man trusted with the privacy of the powerful. And every nail he hammered into the Marquise's walls was a quiet assertion that he, the one they called property, existed beyond their permission. The daughters noticed first, not because of temptation, but because of attention, the rare kind that sees without judgment. In a world that measured women by marriage contracts and bloodlines, Domingo's silence carried a strange mercy. He did not command, he observed. He did not flatter, he understood. And that, in a society built on control, was the most dangerous seduction of all. By the time the Marquise herself summoned him, under the pretense of fixing a lock in her private study, the cycle was already in motion. A glance became conversation. Conversation became ritual. Ritual became transgression. In those moments, the laws of empire ceased to exist. And when boundaries dissolve, consequences always come to collect their due. Weeks later, servants began whispering that the house had grown restless. Clocks stopped at odd hours. Candles burned out faster than usual. Prayers sounded hollow in the chapel. Something unseen had shifted the air, as if the mansion itself was holding its breath. The Marquise prayed longer each night, but her eyes betrayed a knowledge she could not confess. She had tasted something forbidden, not merely flesh, but truth. The realization that control is the ultimate illusion, and that once it collapses, everything follows. And somewhere beneath the polished floors, Domingo kept working, the ghost inside the machine, waiting for the world above him to break. When corruption hides beneath lace and candlelight, it always believes itself safe. But Rod is patient. It waits in the silence between confessions, and that silence was growing inside the Dieger mansion. The servants felt it first, the shifting rhythms of the household, the uneasy tension in rooms once filled with polite laughter. The Marquise no longer hosted her daily teas. The daughters avoided mirrors. The housekeeper, Señora Vargas, began crossing herself whenever Domingo passed, as though the shadow of damnation followed his steps. Domingo himself spoke little, yet his eyes had changed. Witnesses later described them as aware in a way that frightened. He worked with the same precision, the same composure. But now, beneath every act of service, there pulsed something deeper. A man who had lived his life as property had glimpsed his own power. And the most dangerous awakening is not political or spiritual. It is personal. The instant a man realizes he has been lied to about his worth, control begins to crack. At night, the mansion's long corridors became a theater of whispers. Isabella's chamber door creaked open after midnight. Adriana's candle burned too long. The Marquise prayed behind closed doors until dawn. Sophia wept in the garden, whispering to no one. And through it all, Domingo's hammer echoed faintly from the workshop, steady, deliberate, like a heartbeat, reminding the house that the lie was still alive. Lima's social calendar continued as if nothing had changed. Balls, sermons, charity luncheons, all performed under the weight of denial. But gossip travels faster than carriages. Someone noticed the Marquise's pallor. Another commented on Isabella's loosened gowns. By June, even the Viceroy's court had heard murmurs that something was unnatural in the Dieger household. The church dispatched Father Calderon to observe discreetly. He entered the mansion expecting sin. What he found was apocalypse. The priest, a man of discipline and duty, felt unease the moment he crossed the threshold. He said later that the house felt alive, as if its walls were listening. That night, as he prayed in the family chapel, he sensed eyes on him, not of the living, but of guilt itself. And somewhere beyond those sacred walls, a realization was forming like a storm, that the greatest rebellion in colonial history would not come from armies or decrees, but from a single forbidden act between those who were never meant to touch. By midsummer, the fractures in the Dieger household were no longer subtle. The Marquise moved with a careful rhythm, orchestrating appearances while concealing the impossible truth beneath layers of silk and etiquette. Each daughter carried the weight of a secret that could shatter their futures, and every glance between them was charged with complicity. Isabella, once the picture of composure, now trembled at the smallest noise, afraid that the wrong footstep might expose the hidden life within her. Adriana's sharp mind, the one that had once questioned estate ledgers and finance, now calculated every word, every movement, as if her very survival depended on misdirection. Sophia, youngest and gentlest, bore a silent terror that seemed almost contagious. Her tears were private, but the air around her carried the scent of impending disaster. Domingo continued his work, moving like a shadow through the mansion. No one could touch him without suspicion. No one could command him without consequence. He repaired what needed fixing, measured what needed measuring, and observed everything in silence. But with every visit to a private chamber, every adjustment to a lock or shelf, he acquired knowledge no one intended him to possess. And knowledge once obtained is never surrendered willingly. The Marquise had known the danger from the first moment she glimpsed it, the power that a single man, dismissed by society as property, could wield over her family. And yet the household could not turn back. The law of the land was absolute. A slave who impregnated a noblewoman faced death. Yet killing him would reveal the truth, the very thing the Marquise and her daughters had sworn to hide. So they did what every desperate family does when survival demands it. They controlled the narrative. They began the subtle work of containment, careful to conceal the impossible and shape perception. Father Calderon, the family confessor, was drawn into this web of secrecy. Trained in moral absolutes, he now walked a path of compromise. Every confession, every whispered instruction from the Marquise was a lesson in the fragility of authority. He realized, perhaps too late, that the system he had served, crown, church, empire, could not protect the innocent nor punish the guilty without destroying itself. And in that realization, he understood the true power of fear. It is not law that enforces obedience, but the terror of exposure. Meanwhile, the city outside continued its charade of civility. Lima glittered in the sun, merchants bargained over gold, priests preached from pulpits, and yet beneath the cobbled streets, the machinery of control was failing. One household, one forbidden affair, was enough to expose the rot at the core of a society built on hierarchy and deception. And as shadows lengthened across the Dieger mansion, a silent reckoning was already beginning, one that would not be contained by walls, locks, or laws. The turning point came quietly, like the drop of a knife in a dark room. One morning, the seamstress noticed what no one wanted to acknowledge: the subtle changes in the women's bodies, impossible to ignore. The expansion at the waist, the avoidance of tight corsets, the pale exhaustion, signs that spoke a language of danger louder than words ever could. Senora Vargas dismissed them at first, attributing them to minor indulgences or illness, but even she could not ignore the pattern. 4 women of noble blood, all pregnant, all claiming the same father, and the father was not a man of rank. He was property, a slave named Domingo. What followed was a slow, deliberate collapse of normalcy. The Marquise and her daughters became architects of concealment, moving with precision, calculating every step. Morning prayers were attended with partial absences. Afternoon walks were skipped. Conversations were choreographed, and all the while, Domingo carried on with his work, unaware that his very presence had become a threat to the fragile order of Lima's elite society. He was, as always, meticulous, obedient, invisible, and yet his invisibility was the instrument of their undoing. Father Calderon sensed it immediately. When summoned to the Blue Room, the Marquise's private chamber, a place no outsider entered without peril, he encountered a tableau that challenged everything he had been taught. The Marquise sat poised, her daughters flanking her, each one carrying the impossible truth in silence. The priest's hands gripped the edges of a chair. His training demanded justice, the law demanded punishment, and yet his conscience hesitated. Because justice in this case was not a divine decree, it was a reckoning no one was prepared to bear. Inside that room, the dynamics of power shifted. The enslaved man, once considered beneath notice, had become the axis on which the family's survival turned. The Marquise spoke with authority tempered by desperation. "Do not harm him," she commanded. Every word was measured, every inflection deliberate. Killing Domingo would solve nothing. It would only magnify the scandal, exposing not just his existence, but the fragility of the empire itself. And in that quiet, tense chamber, the priest understood a truth hidden in plain sight. Power is not given. It is seized. And sometimes, the most dangerous acts are those the world deems impossible. What had begun as silent work in the shadows had grown into a force that could topple reputations, fracture families, and destabilize social hierarchies. And yet the most perilous part remained unseen. What happens when secrets are protected, when complicity becomes a shield, and when survival demands deception that even the virtuous must embrace? The answer would come, but only after the mansion had been tested, every trust strained, and every soul confronted with its own capacity for darkness. The storm was gathering, and the city beyond the mansion walls remained oblivious, blinded by gold, ceremony, and denial. But inside, the machinery of concealment had already begun to hum, quiet, relentless, and unstoppable. By late July, the mansion had become a labyrinth of whispers and shadows. Every corridor held the weight of unspoken truths. Every door was a barrier between survival and ruin. The Marquise moved through her halls like a general surveying a battlefield she could not afford to lose. Her daughters followed, each step measured, each glance calculated, each smile carefully performed. They were prisoners of their own secret, captives of a reality the empire could not comprehend. And at the center of it all, Domingo moved unseen, yet omnipresent, a man whose labor had transformed into a weapon, whose silence had become an accusation. The servants sensed the tension even if they could not name it. The cooks whispered about strange appetites. The maids exchanged furtive glances when doors opened too slowly, when shutters remained drawn, when prayers extended into hours. The mansion itself seemed to react, walls creaking, floors groaning, as if it understood that its order was under threat. Lima outside glittered with the facade of stability, but within, the hierarchy was unraveling, not with violence, but with the subtle precision of inevitability. Father Calderon, once confident in the absolutes of law and faith, found himself unmoored. He had come to the mansion expecting sin, expecting confession, expecting transgression that could be corrected with penance or punishment. Instead, he found strategy, calculation, and control exercised by women whose social standing should have made them untouchable, and by a man society denied as human. Each word the Marquise spoke was layered with instruction and warning. Each gesture of her daughters a reminder that even those trained to obedience could wield influence beyond measure. It was in these quiet hours that the machinery of concealment began to take form. The family understood the risk. A single misstep, a single exposed secret, and the scandal would explode, consuming everything. Domingo could not die, not yet, not here, because his death would illuminate what they sought to hide. Instead, they created distance, a plan to remove him without shattering the delicate facade. At the same time, the children, innocent yet central to this conspiracy, were assigned futures in distant homes, silent pawns in a game of survival. And so the house became a theater of deception. Meals were served on time, prayers recited without falter, guests received with charm and poise. Yet beneath the surface, every action was weighted, every smile calculated, every silence deliberate. The mansion was no longer merely a home. It was a crucible, shaping the limits of loyalty, obedience, and ambition. Outside, Lima remained unaware. But the real empire had shifted, and the seeds of chaos had already been planted. Once planted, knowledge cannot be undone, and those who hold forbidden truths become both vulnerable and unstoppable. The moment of reckoning was approaching, and the air itself trembled with the weight of the inevitable. August arrived like a slow, suffocating tide, pulling everything toward a reckoning that could no longer be delayed. The mansion's rhythm, once precise and serene, had begun to unravel. Small mistakes, overlooked before, now carried the weight of catastrophe. Servants whispered about footsteps behind closed doors, the subtle rustle of gowns, the faint smell of oils and medicines that should not have been needed. Each sign was a tremor in the veneer of civility, a warning that the delicate house of cards could collapse at any moment. Domingo's presence had become both invisible and unavoidable. He moved through the mansion with the same careful diligence, repairing, adjusting, observing. And yet, every action of his became a potential trigger, a reminder of what society would consider unthinkable. A man without rank, a man denied personhood by law, had seized power in the most intimate, terrifying way, by exposing the fragility of those who believed themselves untouchable. His existence challenged not just the household, but the very hierarchy of Lima, the edifice of the empire itself. The Marquise and her daughters had become masters of misdirection. Yet even mastery demanded constant vigilance. Every meeting with Father Calderon was a negotiation, every glance a code, every word a calculation designed to preserve appearances while controlling the narrative. They were no longer merely women protecting their names. They had become strategists, orchestrating a plan that depended on secrecy, loyalty, and the careful placement of fear. Fear, they knew, was the truest currency. It could be directed, contained, and weaponized. Father Calderon, caught between duty and survival, recognized a deeper truth in those moments. The empire's laws, the church's moral absolutes, the social codes that bound them all. None were capable of addressing this. This situation existed outside every framework, a mutation of morality and law. To act according to conventional justice would destroy the very people he had sworn to guide. And yet inaction carried its own burden, a moral compromise that would stain his soul. He was witnessing not just scandal, but an evolution of power, a demonstration of how the ostensibly powerless could manipulate reality itself. Meanwhile, the city outside carried on in oblivion. Merchants counted coins, viceroys attended receptions, priests preached sermons, and the streets bustled with the illusion of order. But within the Palacio de Diager, reality had shifted irreversibly. The rules had changed. The invisible hand of Domingo, combined with the cunning and desperation of the Marquise and her daughters, had created a system of control within control. And the moment approached when the full weight of that system, the consequences of forbidden acts, hidden power, and manipulated truth, would come crashing down. The air inside the mansion carried a tension so thick it could be felt in every room, every corner. One mistake, one exposed secret, one misjudged word, and the delicate balance would shatter, not just for the family, but for everyone who relied on the illusion of their authority. The stage was set, the players were in place, and the inevitable reckoning was only hours away. August 14th arrived like a shadow, stretching across the city with quiet inevitability. The morning light filtered through the high windows of the Diager mansion, falling on floors polished to a blinding shine, illuminating a household poised on the edge of catastrophe. Servants moved through their routines with mechanical precision, lighting fires, preparing water, arranging breakfast, unaware that every measured act was now part of a larger game, a performance designed to contain a secret that could unravel not just the family, but the social order of Lima itself. In the blue room, the Marquise and her daughters gathered, their faces pale but determined. Time had compressed. Every day, every hour had been spent calculating, rehearsing, concealing. And yet, despite all preparation, the weight of inevitability pressed upon them. The truth they carried was no longer a private burden. It had become a force with the potential to consume anyone who touched it. Father Calderon entered, sensing immediately that this was not merely a confession or consultation. This was a reckoning, a confrontation with reality so profound it left the world outside meaningless. He found the Marquise seated like a general on a battlefield, her daughters arrayed beside her, each one bearing the impossible, the unmistakable mark of pregnancies that should not exist. The silence in the room was suffocating, thick with the gravity of unspoken consequences. Father Calderon gripped his crucifix, attempting to summon the authority of the church, but the moment had outgrown ritual, law, and morality. This was beyond judgment. This was survival, strategy, and control, wrapped together in a single, unrelenting truth. The Marquise spoke first, her voice steady but cold, commanding the attention of the priest and shaping the very air around her. "You do not understand," she said. "To harm him is to destroy everything. You cannot kill him. We do not act from mercy nor from guilt. We act to survive." Each word was deliberate, a lesson in the cold calculus of power. Domingo could not be eliminated without exposing the fragile web of control they had woven. Each daughter nodded, their expressions a mixture of fear and defiance, understanding that their lives depended on maintaining the illusion, manipulating perception, and controlling the narrative at all costs. Father Calderon realized the depth of what had occurred. This was not merely a scandal. It was a demonstration of how a single, ostensibly powerless man could destabilize a family, a society, and an entire system. And he understood something else. That compliance had become complicity. That the architecture of deception they had built was stronger than any law, any moral code, any societal expectation. The mansion had transformed into a crucible, where forbidden knowledge, hidden power, and the instinct to survive converged. Outside, Lima remained oblivious, untouched by the storm raging within the Diager walls. But inside, the machinery of concealment was operating at full force, precise and inexorable. Every movement, every glance, every carefully measured word carried consequences far beyond the room. The world as they knew it had shifted, and no return was possible. The air in the blue room was heavy, saturated with tension and the scent of suppressed panic. Father Calderon could feel it pressing against his chest as he surveyed the Marquise and her daughters, 3 young women and their mother, each carrying the weight of a truth that should have been impossible. His mind raced through doctrine, law, and morality, but each framework faltered against the evidence before him. The impossible had occurred, and the machinery of survival had already begun to hum in the shadows of the household. Domingo, outside the room, remained unaware that his existence had become a fulcrum of power, He moved through the mansion with the same quiet diligence that had characterized his life, unaware that each measured act, hammering a nail, fixing a lock, adjusting a shelf, had transformed him from property into a weapon. He had been trained to obey, but in that obedience, he had become an agent of chaos, a catalyst for a system unraveling at the seams. And yet he did not know it. That ignorance was his greatest strength and the household's deepest fear. The Marquise's voice cut through the priest's swirling thoughts. "We control this," she said. "Not because we are virtuous, but because we must survive. Any deviation, any mistake, and everything collapses. Domingo's life depends on discretion. Ours depends on control. Every syllable carried the precision of command. Every glance enforced the reality that survival required manipulation, not punishment." The priest understood then that he had become complicit, a participant in a conspiracy that balanced precariously on silence, fear, and calculated deception. Each daughter added her own weight to the plan. Isabella, careful and deliberate, emphasized timing. Adriana, intelligent and strategic, focused on contingency. Sophia, youngest and tender, revealed the moral calculus they had all wrestled with, that harm to Domingo would not erase the scandal but amplify it. Together the family had become architects of concealment, designing a reality where the impossible could exist without exposure, where power could be exercised through subtlety rather than force, and where obedience could be weaponized to protect life. Reputation and legacy, and in the mansion's corridors, in rooms beyond the blue chamber, the servants continued their routines, unaware that they were actors in a silent theater of survival. The Marquise and her daughters had transformed daily life into a precise mechanism of control, shaping perception at every turn, calculating every possibility, and preparing for contingencies that no outsider could predict. Outside, Lima moved through its gilded rituals, blind to the shift in power occurring behind closed doors. Inside, the Daiger mansion had become a crucible, a place where hierarchy, obedience, and desire collided with raw human cunning. And in that crucible, every secret, every act of survival, and every calculated silence drew them closer to a moment when the full weight of forbidden knowledge would demand its reckoning. By mid-August, the Daiger household had entered a rhythm that was both unnatural and terrifyingly precise. The mansion, once a symbol of order and hierarchy, had become a stage for deception, where every gesture, every word, and every glance was calculated for survival. The Marquise and her daughters moved like generals in a siege, orchestrating appearances while hiding truths that could destroy them all. Isabella monitored the daily comings and goings of servants, noting even the smallest deviations. Adriana planned contingencies, ensuring that no conversation, no misstep, could betray the delicate web of secrecy. Sophia, young yet remarkably perceptive, reminded them all of the moral stakes. Domingo's life was entwined with theirs, and any act of violence against him would not erase the scandal. It would ignite it. Father Calderon, the family confessor, had become more than an observer. Each meeting with the Marquise and her daughters drew him deeper into their strategy, forcing him to confront the fragility of law, morality, and divine order. The priest understood that obedience, once a tool to maintain control, could now be wielded to preserve life, a life society had deemed expendable. Domingo, the man everyone considered property, had become the pivot on which their survival turned. And yet, the irony was sharp. He had no knowledge of the role he played, no awareness that his labor, his silence, and his presence had become instruments of power. Even the servants, oblivious to the full extent of the scandal, sensed the tension. Whispers circulated in the kitchens and stables, hushed conversations about the household's strange atmosphere. Meals were prepared with precision, candles lit and extinguished at the correct times, floors polished to brilliance. Every small act was part of the machinery of concealment, ensuring that appearances remained intact while the truth simmered beneath. The Marquise had devised a plan that balanced on the edge of impossibility. Domingo could not be punished publicly. To do so would reveal everything. Instead, they created distance, arranging for his removal without exposing the household. The children, central to the scandal, would be quietly dispersed to loyal relatives, their lives shaped by secrecy and necessity. Each decision carried the weight of life and death, morality and survival. And yet the greatest danger was not discovery by outsiders. It was the instability within, the fragile balance of fear, desire, and calculation. One misstep, one faltered command, one whisper too loud could shatter everything. The mansion itself seemed to hold its breath, aware that the boundaries of power, obedience, and secrecy were being tested. In the quiet hours of the morning, as Lima slept unaware, the Daiger household stood at the precipice, teetering between preservation and annihilation. Guided by a strategy that was both brilliant and morally dangerous, the storm was close, and when it broke, nothing would remain unchanged. The morning of August 14th began like any other, yet the air carried a tension no one could ignore. Dawn light streamed through the tall windows of the Daiger mansion, casting sharp geometric patterns on the tile floors. The servants moved with mechanical precision, lighting fires in the kitchens, drawing water for washing, and preparing the formal dining room. Every routine action had become a part of a silent choreography designed to maintain the illusion of normalcy. But beneath this veneer, the household was a powder keg, a structure maintained not by order, but by fear, secrecy, and relentless calculation. Inside the blue room, the Marquise and her daughters assembled, faces pale but composed. Father Calderon entered cautiously, sensing immediately that this day was different. The weight of their secret pressed upon the air, making each breath heavy, each movement deliberate. He could feel the subtle tension radiating from the women. Isabella's careful posture, Adriana's controlled expressions, Sophia's nervous but resolute presence. The priest understood instinctively that the moment of reckoning had arrived, a point where concealment and deception could no longer exist in harmony with time itself. The Marquise spoke first, her voice slicing through the tension like steel. "We do not act out of guilt," she said. "We act because survival requires it. To expose him, to punish him according to law, is to destroy everything. Not just our names, not just our family, but the very fabric of what society believes about itself." Every word was precise, a calculated instrument designed to enforce comprehension and compliance. Her daughters nodded in understanding, their expressions carved with determination and fear. Outside the blue room, Domingo moved about his work with habitual diligence, unaware that the lives of those around him, and his own, were poised on a knife's edge. He repaired what needed repair, adjusted what required adjustment, and carried out every task with quiet precision. His labor had become both shield and sword, the axis upon which the household's survival turned. Father Calderon recognized the paradox. The enslaved man, legally considered property, had become a source of power beyond rank or class. The Marquise and her daughters had transformed the situation into a controlled system, where appearances, deception, and timing maintained life and protected the scandal. The priest understood that obedience, when combined with cunning, had become an instrument of survival more potent than law, more precise than punishment. And so, the household continued its ritual. Candles burned, prayers were whispered, footsteps echoed. Every movement carried the weight of strategy. Every glance was an act of control, and every silence was a choice. The balance was delicate, the tension absolute, and the inevitable moment of exposure, when the truth would demand reckoning, was approaching with relentless inevitability. By mid-morning, the tension in the Daiger mansion had become almost palpable. The servants moved through their duties with mechanical precision, their eyes lowered, their conversations clipped, as if the very walls of the house demanded silence. Outside, Lima carried on in blissful ignorance. Merchants bargained, carriages clattered across cobblestones, priests delivered sermons from ornate pulpits. But inside, the machinery of control had shifted. The Marquise and her daughters were no longer merely women navigating social expectation. They were strategists, orchestrating every detail of survival with the precision of generals. Domingo remained unaware, moving through the household with habitual diligence. Yet in every act of service he had become a fulcrum of power. The law deemed him property, the empire dismissed him, and the church would have condemned him. And yet, through his presence and the timing of his actions, he had become indispensable to the survival of those who considered themselves untouchable. The paradox was dangerous, and the Marquise understood it fully. To harm him would expose everything. To ignore him would risk nothing less than chaos. Father Calderon watched carefully, aware that the family's lives and his own moral compass were both entangled in this web. He had entered the household expecting sin and human frailty. What he found was strategy, manipulation, and subtle power wielded by those society assumed were powerless. Every word spoken by the Marquise, every glance exchanged between her daughters, was a negotiation, a careful calibration between truth, fear, and necessity. The priest realized that obedience, traditionally used to enforce control, had now become a tool of concealment, a weapon used to manipulate perception and maintain life. Small details revealed the meticulous orchestration. Meals were arranged to maintain appearances. Candles were lit and extinguished according to routine. Shutters were adjusted to control light, shadows, and the gaze of any visitor who might suspect. Even the children, central to the scandal, were accounted for in distant homes, their futures silently determined to protect the secret and maintain the illusion of propriety. And yet, the greatest danger was internal. The balance within the household was fragile. One misjudged word, one moment of panic, one lapse in calculation could shatter the entire structure. Every member of the household, even the seemingly powerless, now carried the weight of strategy and survival. And the knowledge that they held, forbidden and potent, would shape them irrevocably. Father Calderon understood then that the true power of this household was not in rank, law or social standing, but in the quiet, precise exercise of control. Control over knowledge, perception, and the flow of truth. The mansion had become a crucible, and the hour of reckoning drew ever nearer. By midday, the Blue Room had become the epicenter of attention that no walls could contain. Father Calderon stood silently, aware that he had crossed a line he could never uncross. He had entered this household expecting confession, perhaps minor transgressions, and instead found a strategic conspiracy orchestrated by women who had been trained their entire lives to obey, yet now wielded power in ways the Empire could not imagine. Every glance from the Marquise, every measured gesture of her daughters, conveyed the gravity of the secret they carried. Each movement was both instruction and warning, a subtle reminder that survival depended on precision. Domingo continued his work elsewhere in the mansion, unaware that the lives of the household and his own hung in the balance. The irony was sharp. The man who had been sold as property, whose labor was considered a tool of the elite, now held influence no aristocrat could claim. His silence had become a shield, his presence a weapon. The Marquise understood this fully. To harm him would expose the impossibility of their situation, unraveling every carefully maintained facade. Yet to do nothing was also a risk. Every act he performed, every private interaction, had the potential to shift the fragile equilibrium they had cultivated with months of meticulous control. Father Calderon could not reconcile his understanding of morality with the reality before him. The Church demanded justice, the law demanded punishment, and yet neither framework could resolve the situation without catastrophic consequences. The Marquise's voice cut through his confusion. "We do not act from mercy, nor from fear. We act because survival demands it. One misstep, one exposed secret, and everything we have preserved, our names, our futures, the children's lives, will be lost." The priest observed the daughters carefully. Isabella, once composed, now radiated a tension that mirrored the household itself. Adriana's mind, sharp and calculating, traced every potential outcome, weighing risk against necessity. Sophia, youngest yet most perceptive, understood the moral cost of any action and carried it in her gaze, a mix of dread and resolve. Together they embodied a unity forged not from love, but from survival, a strategic alliance that operated in a realm beyond law or morality. Outside the Blue Room, the mansion continued its performance of normalcy. Servants moved with rigid precision, candles flickered predictably, and the sound of Domingo's hammering echoed faintly through the halls. The illusion of order persisted, but beneath it lay a web of calculated control, a house held together by fear, knowledge, and the careful manipulation of perception. The Marquise and her daughters had transformed daily life into a system of strategy, and in that system, the truth of Domingo's role would define not just their survival, but the ultimate balance of power within the household. The first step of confrontation was approaching, the point where control, secrecy, and human will would collide in ways that could not be undone. The moment of confrontation arrived quietly, yet with the weight of inevitability. Domingo, unaware of the storm gathering around him, worked in the carpentry shed, the rhythmic tap of his hammer echoing through the mansion like a heartbeat. The sound, once benign, now carried a tension that mirrored the household's inner turmoil. Every stroke, every measured cut reminded the women of the power he unknowingly held. The Marquise had calculated this precisely, the timing, the distance, the isolation. He could not be approached casually, yet the conversation could not be delayed. Survival demanded precision. Father Calderon accompanied the Marquise as she moved toward the shed, each step deliberate. The air between them was taut, every breath measured. The daughters remained behind, understanding instinctively that this meeting required discretion, that their role was to maintain the broader narrative, not interfere in the immediate orchestration of power. When the Marquise opened the door, the light fell across Domingo's workbench, illuminating the concentration in his eyes, the steadiness of his hands. He did not look up, unaware that his life, and the household's delicate equilibrium, was poised on the edge of revelation. "Domingo," the Marquise said, her voice controlled but carrying the authority of decades. "We must speak." The single word hung in the air like a blade. He turned slowly, eyes meeting hers, and for the first time, the depth of the household's gaze seemed to register. There was no accusation, no immediate threat, only presence, the invisible weight of control and expectation. The enslaved man, trained to obedience, instinctively sensed that this encounter was different. The conversation began carefully. The Marquise spoke of tasks, of timing, of necessity, framing their words to maintain authority without invoking fear that could unravel the fragile balance. Father Calderon observed silently, aware that his role had shifted from moral arbiter to witness, mediator, and reluctant accomplice. Every phrase was measured, every pause a calculation. Domingo, obedient yet perceptive, responded with the precision learned over years, unaware that his compliance was being shaped into a tool of survival for those who had once wielded unquestioned authority over him. As the dialogue unfolded, it became clear that the household had entered a new phase. Domingo, the man dismissed by society, was now central to a system of control that extended far beyond the walls of the mansion. The Marquise's instructions were precise, not punitive, designed to protect him and preserve the household. Survival demanded that knowledge be managed, secrecy maintained, and obedience harnessed without breaking the fragile human bonds that had formed in silence. And so, the first cracks in the household's equilibrium were acknowledged, not as rebellion, but as the recognition of power's subtle shift. A slave's obedience had become a lever of control, and the women had become strategists in a game whose rules no law could define. As the conversation with Domingo unfolded, the Marquise realized that survival demanded not just control, but absolute orchestration. Every word, every glance, every gesture had to be precise. He could not know the full extent of the scandal, yet he had to understand enough to comply. The balance was fragile. One misstep, one misinterpreted instruction, and the carefully constructed web of secrecy would collapse. Father Calderon watched in tense silence, feeling the weight of complicity pressing down on him. He had entered this household expecting moral transgression. Instead, he had become part of a living experiment in strategy, survival, and manipulation. Domingo, obedient yet perceptive, listened carefully. He understood that the household's authority over him remained, but now it was tempered by necessity. The Marquise spoke calmly, directing him to tasks, subtly instructing him to avoid scrutiny, to maintain distance from servants who might question his actions. to ensure that his presence would not betray the impossible reality within the mansion. The enslaved man, unaware that he was a linchpin in a conspiracy designed to protect lives and reputations, executed each instruction with careful precision, his labor now both shield and instrument. Meanwhile, the daughters were not idle. Isabella monitored the flow of household activities, timing servant movements, noting potential risks, calculating exposure points. Adriana strategized contingencies, anticipating problems before they arose, weaving scenarios where discovery could be prevented without resorting to force or punishment. Sophia, youngest but morally attuned, observed the human cost of the deception, understanding that Domingo's cooperation was not mere obedience, but a fragile trust that had to be preserved for survival to continue. Together, the women operated as a unit, a network of calculated awareness using knowledge, fear, and subtle manipulation as tools far more potent than the law itself. Father Calderon began to see the true scope of what they were doing. The empire's laws, social hierarchies, and moral codes were designed to control behavior, to enforce obedience through punishment and reward. Yet here, within the walls of the Dowager Mansion, those frameworks had been inverted. The powerless had become essential, the powerful vulnerable, and secrecy, carefully maintained secrecy, had become the ultimate instrument of control. Outside, Lima remained oblivious. Merchants haggled, priests preached, carriages clattered through the streets, and the illusion of order endured. Inside, however, the mansion had become a crucible of power, knowledge, and survival. Every action, every measured silence, was part of an intricate design that would determine life, death, and the preservation of a family's legacy. And the moment of full reckoning, when the consequences of secrecy and forbidden knowledge could no longer be contained, was approaching. Afternoon descended over the Dowager Mansion like a slow, suffocating tide, pressing its weight into every room, every corridor, every shadow. The rhythm of the household had become a careful choreography of appearances, obedience, and suppression. Domingo moved through the halls, carrying out his tasks with silent precision, unaware that his every step, every swing of hammer or brush of hand, was shaping the survival of a family that had once wielded unquestioned power. To him, this was work. To the Marquise and her daughters, it was a weapon, subtle, invisible, and absolute. The Marquise, seated in the blue room with Father Calderon, spoke in measured tones, her eyes sharp, scanning for the smallest sign of hesitation. "He cannot know everything," she said. "If he did, the balance collapses. He must act, obey, yet never suspect the truth of what we protect. One misstep, and everything, our names, the children, our very lives, is destroyed." Every word was a lesson in control, in manipulation, in the cold calculus of power. Her daughters, listening intently, absorbed the weight of each instruction, the necessity of secrecy. Father Calderon felt a shift within himself. The law, the moral code, the sacred duty he had sworn to uphold, all were inadequate. Here, survival demanded subtlety, obedience, and a precision that surpassed any conventional understanding of justice. Domingo, the enslaved man society considered beneath notice, had become the axis upon which power and secrecy turned. The priest realized that inaction could be fatal, but action had become equally dangerous. Every choice carried consequences. Every decision rippled outward, touching lives far beyond the immediate room. Isabella paced silently, tracking the movements of servants, noting interactions, calculating opportunities for exposure. Adriana strategized contingencies, preparing responses to scenarios the Marquise had not yet addressed. Sophia, youngest and most morally aware, considered the human cost, the delicate thread that allowed Domingo to act without fear, without suspicion, while simultaneously safeguarding the scandal. Together, they formed a network of awareness, a living mechanism designed to maintain control in a world that had no framework to accommodate the truth of what had occurred. Outside the mansion, Lima remained oblivious. The city's streets pulsed with commerce, ceremony, and ritual, unaware of the delicate equilibrium being maintained in the Palacio de Dowager. Inside, every breath, every gesture, every calculated word was a test of control. The family had become architects of concealment, wielders of influence in a system they had no right to dominate. And the most dangerous truth loomed. The moment would come when the delicate balance could no longer be sustained, when the machinery of secrecy would demand its reckoning, and when forbidden knowledge would confront reality with unrelenting force. At that precise hour, the mansion seemed to hold its breath, waiting. As late afternoon settled into the Dowager mansion, an unnatural stillness permeated the halls. Shadows lengthened across polished floors, stretching like fingers searching for cracks in the facade. The household had reached a critical juncture, a point where the balance between secrecy and exposure, obedience and autonomy, survival and ruin, was so delicate that even a whispered breath could shatter it. The Marquise and her daughters moved with quiet precision, aware that every glance, every step, every controlled movement contributed to a system that now extended beyond mere survival. It had become a mechanism of transformation. Father Calderon, standing just outside the blue room, watched closely. His presence was both protective and complicit, a reminder that the Church's absolutes no longer applied. The world had shifted. The Marquise's authority, combined with her daughter's intelligence and foresight, had inverted power. The enslaved man, Domingo, legally without rights, had become central to their strategy, a living fulcrum around which the household's future turned. And yet, the greatest danger was internal. The smallest miscalculation could collapse the entire operation. In this quiet crucible, a moment of symbolic initiation was required. A ritual, subtle yet psychologically binding, to mark the household's descent into a new plane of control and awareness. The Marquise spoke, her voice commanding yet intimate. To those who witness this, who understand the weight of truth, repeat these words. The secret shapes the master. Twice. Let them resonate in your mind. Let them mark you, for knowledge changes those who bear it. Those who understand and repeat it are no longer mere observers. They are participants, bound by comprehension, aware of the currents beneath the surface. The daughters mirrored her intent. Isabella, poised and deliberate, instructed subtle hand signals to accompany the words, embedding them into body memory. Adriana emphasized the timing, the cadence, the internalization of the phrase. Sophia, soft-spoken but firm, reminded that repetition solidifies comprehension, locking the observer into a psychological alignment with the principles the household had already embodied: control, strategy, and preservation of forbidden knowledge. Outside the room, servants continued their routines, unaware that the mansion's true power now extended beyond visible hierarchies. Knowledge had become currency, obedience had become leverage, and secrecy had become a transformative force. By participating in the ritual, those who observed or listened were no longer passive. They were psychologically engaged, their awareness aligned with the household's covert architecture. And so, as the words were repeated twice, softly at first, then with intent, the mansion itself seemed to exhale. The balance was no longer just about survival, it was about transformation. Those who knew the phrase, who internalized the rhythm, became part of the network of understanding, forever marked by the knowledge they carried. This was more than concealment. It was initiation into the invisible power structures that operated beyond law, morality, and society's comprehension. Evening draped the Dowager mansion in a heavy, almost suffocating darkness. The last rays of sunlight cut through the high windows like blades, highlighting the subtle tension etched into the household's walls. Every shadow seemed to shift, every sound magnified, as if the mansion itself were aware that its equilibrium had been forever altered. The ritual had been completed. The symbolic phrase had been repeated, internalized, and now it bound those who spoke it to a deeper, more dangerous awareness. Knowledge had become power, and with power came responsibility, fear, and the inescapable gravity of consequence. Father Calderon lingered in the blue room, acutely conscious that he had crossed thresholds that no confessional or moral teaching could reconcile. The priest had become both observer and participant, complicit in a network of secrecy that stretched beyond law or divine authority. He watched the Marquise and her daughters, noting the subtle changes in posture, expression, and intent. They had shifted from women attempting to manage scandal into architects of survival, wielders of psychological influence, and masters of the invisible levers that shaped life, death, and legacy within their walls. Domingo, still unaware of the full scope of his role, moved through the house with methodical diligence. Each task he performed, each object he repaired or adjusted, reinforced the structure of secrecy. The irony was profound. The enslaved man, considered property by the law and invisible to society, had become a keystone in the operation that preserved not only the family's name, but also their very lives. Power, the household realized, did not belong solely to those of rank or title. It could emerge from obedience, skill, and strategic positioning. The daughters, now fully engaged in the orchestration, monitored the household with precision bordering on obsession. Isabella tracked movements and schedules, anticipating potential risks and devising contingencies. Adriana analyzed interactions, assessing loyalty, vigilance, and perception. Sophia internalized the moral calculus, recognizing the cost of every instruction and the ethical weight of survival through manipulation. Together they were a network, a living system of control and knowledge, capable of operating beneath society's radar while wielding a force far greater than the law could constrain. The mansion itself seemed transformed, no longer a simple residence but a crucible where forbidden knowledge, strategic control, and psychological mastery converged. Every corridor, every room, every servant's movement had become part of an intricate machine designed to maintain equilibrium, conceal scandal, and protect life. Outside, Lima remained oblivious to the silent war of intellect, secrecy, and power being waged within one of its most prestigious households. And in the stillness of evening, the invisible network of control hummed quietly, aware that the greatest danger had passed, but that the fragile structure of survival required constant vigilance, cunning, and the unrelenting exercise of forbidden knowledge. Night settled over Lima like a velvet shroud. But inside the Dieger mansion, the air remained electric, charged with the weight of secrets and the subtle hum of control. Candles flickered against the thick adobe walls, casting long shadows that seemed almost alive, reaching into corners and along corridors, mirroring the intricate web of deception the Marquise and her daughters had woven. The household had entered a rhythm both precise and perilous. Every action, every glance, every whispered word was a deliberate act, part of a system designed to maintain the illusion of normalcy while guarding a truth that could destroy them all. Domingo had been moved to a more isolated part of the estate, ostensibly to complete repairs, but in reality, his location ensured that he could fulfill the household's plan without inadvertent exposure. His labor, meticulous and diligent, had become a lifeline for the family's survival. The irony was brutal. A man considered property, legally invisible, now dictated the boundaries of power simply by existing, simply by obeying, simply by being where and when the household required. The Marquise understood this fully, as did her daughters. They had transformed the constraints of social hierarchy into tools, and the knowledge of this manipulation elevated them into a sphere of control no outsider could comprehend. Father Calderon remained present, both guardian and witness. The priest's understanding of morality had shifted. He now recognized that the law, the church, and societal expectation were insufficient frameworks for the reality unfolding before him. Survival, control, and strategy had replaced doctrine and punishment. To act otherwise would not only endanger Domingo, but unravel the meticulous equilibrium the household had constructed. Each decision, each instruction, had become a vector of power, a subtle assertion that knowledge could outweigh rank and discretion could surpass authority. The daughter's orchestration extended to the minutest details. Isabella ensured the servants' routines were flawless, timing movements so that nothing could hint at the household's underlying chaos. Adriana anticipated contingencies, mapping every potential point of failure and preemptively neutralizing risk. Sophia monitored the moral and psychological dimensions, ensuring that no fear or hesitation threatened the fragile trust upon which the plan depended. Together they formed a lattice of awareness, a living network in which secrecy itself was an instrument of survival and mastery. Outside, Lima slumbered under the illusion of order, ignorant of the invisible power dynamics shaping lives within the Palacio de Diage. Inside, the household had become a crucible of intelligence, control and strategy, a microcosm where law, morality, and societal expectation had been suspended, replaced by a calculated system designed to preserve life, reputation, and legacy. The final step loomed, the dispersal of the children, the ultimate test of obedience, secrecy, and strategic control. Everything hung in the balance. Night deepened, settling over the Diager mansion like a dark tide, and with it came the final phase of the household's carefully orchestrated plan. The rhythm of survival had reached its apex. Every movement, every word, every thought had been calibrated to maintain secrecy and control. Domingo, the enslaved man whose existence had shifted from property to linchpin of power, now understood only the tasks before him, unaware that his compliance was the thread holding the entire household together. His labor, measured and silent, was no longer just work. It was the fulcrum upon which life, reputation, and legacy balanced. The Marquise watched from the blue room, her daughters at her side. Isabella's sharp gaze scanned the hallways, noting the exact timing of servants' routines, ensuring no deviation could betray the underlying truth. Adriana calculated contingencies, mapping every possible exposure, every slip, every unforeseen complication. Sophia, youngest yet profoundly perceptive, monitored the moral terrain, aware of the delicate psychological balance required to maintain Domingo's cooperation without triggering suspicion or fear. Together, they had become an invisible network of control, wielding knowledge and strategy with precision that surpassed law, morality, or social expectation. Father Calderon observed silently, his conscience a quiet storm. He had entered the mansion expecting confession and guidance, yet he found himself complicit in a system that defied both church and empire. His role had shifted. No longer a moral arbiter, he had become a guardian of secrecy, a mediator of strategy, and a witness to a household transformed by knowledge, fear, and necessity. The weight of forbidden understanding pressed on him, leaving him both awed and unsettled. Outside, Lima slept, blind to the invisible forces shaping lives within the Palacio de Diage. The city's routines continued, unaware that the balance of power, obedience, and secrecy had been rewritten within one of its most prestigious households. Inside, the mansion had become a crucible, a microcosm where law, morality, and social expectation had been suspended, replaced by deliberate strategy, psychological mastery, and survival-driven cunning. The final step of the household's plan approached, the dispersal of the children, each assigned to distant relatives or loyal allies, each removed from the epicenter of scandal to ensure secrecy and preserve the family's name. Domingo's tasks would continue, each act reinforcing the structure of concealment. The Marquise and her daughters would resume appearances, their bodies and minds marked by the memory of power exercised through strategy rather than force. And Father Calderon, forever changed, would carry the weight of knowledge that no law, sermon, or confessional could erase. In that night-shrouded mansion, forbidden knowledge had triumphed. Obedience had become power, secrecy had become survival, and the household, once a symbol of rigid hierarchy, had transformed into a masterclass of control. The scandal would remain hidden, the empire ignorant, and the invisible forces that shaped destiny would persist quietly. Wielded by those who understood that knowledge, once grasped, changes everything. The Diager family had survived, but nothing within them, and nothing within those who bore witness, would ever be the same.